Imagine that today you're given the task of organizing the biggest and most complex database in your entire country, but they take away your computer, the internet, and even electricity. They only give you quills, thousands of loose pieces of parchment, and an impossible deadline. Today you take out your phone and look up the meaning of any word in 2 seconds. But centuries ago, capturing an entire language from scratch wasn't just a writing exercise, it was a real logistical nightmare. It was one of the most monumental, chaotic, and exasperating information management projects in human history. Today we're going to uncover the methods behind how the first Spanish dictionaries were built. The first Spanish dictionaries weren't born as books organized in volumes and perfectly bound, like the ones we consult today in any library or see on a screen or in an academic edition. Their origin was much more handcrafted than you can imagine. To understand this origin, we must travel back to the early formation of the Castilian language in the heart of the Middle Ages. Before there was a proper dictionary in the modern sense, words began to be recorded as glosses, which were small notes placed in the margins or between the lines of manuscripts. The manuscripts were written in Latin, and the notes clarified difficult terms of a language that was already beginning to be abandoned and replaced by the new Hispanic Proto-Romance dialect. It should be clarified that these notes were indeed made in the native language of the local speakers. The Royal Spanish Academy itself defines the gloss in this way, and the Royal Academy of History points out that in the Codex of the Emilian Glosses, it was precisely those marginal and interlinear notes that revealed what could be some of the earliest forms of Hispanic Romance. Although this is still widely debated, since some linguists claim that they are actually a Proto-Aragonese dialect. Meanwhile, in the monastery of Silos in Castile and Leon, something very particular was happening in writing: the word-for-word replacement of Latin texts. The monk would see a complex Latin term and write its direct equivalent in Iberian Romance. For example, what was written in Latin as igna ignorantibus in Romance was underlined as non sapientes, that is, those who do not know, or the ignorant. Another example is the translation of the Latin statim to the Romance luego, to mean immediately, or from the Latin in labina to the Romance in fungo, which means in the mud or sludge. In this way, the Emilian and Silos glosses were not formal dictionaries, but they constitute the first physical record of lexical equivalences. When the printing press made it possible to create broader repertoires, that record was no longer made only in the margins of codices and began to take the form of organized works. One of the earliest milestones was the Universal Vocabulary in Latin and Romance by Alfonso de Palencia, printed in Seville in 1490. The academic tradition recognizes it as one of the first contributions to Spanish lexicography, and specialized studies show that it was arranged in 2 columns. On the left, the Latin text, and on the right, its Castilian translation. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell to remind you when there's a new video. Shortly after, Antonio de Nebrija took a fundamental step in this process. According to the Royal Spanish Academy and the Miguel de Cervantes Virtual Library, his Latin-Spanish dictionary was published in 1492, and the Spanish-Latin dictionary between 1494 and 1492.
295.
Specialists consider these works as the starting point of modern bilingual Spanish lexicography. In addition, studies on the Romance to Latin vocabulary show that its main purpose was to facilitate the translation from Romance to Latin, especially in academic and scholarly contexts. For this reason, many words did not yet appear with broad definitions, but rather with their equivalent in the other language. In the same way, grammatical information was usually represented partially or implicitly, since it was assumed that the reader was proficient in Latin grammar. As a result, Nebrija's dictionary was not yet intended as a complete repertoire of Castilian for any reader, but rather as a practical tool to mediate between two languages. The great leap toward an internal record of Spanish came with Sebastián de Covarrubias and his Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española, published in 1611. The RA presents it as one of the major milestones prior to the academic dictionary, and some linguists emphasize that it was the first monolingual Spanish dictionary. But its way of recording words still preserved a lot, including the humanist thinking of the time. Covarrubias worked with a fundamentally etymological purpose. He defined words, added observations about their use, collected proverbs and idiomatic expressions, and mixed linguistic aspects with historical, mythological, and encyclopedic ones. The result was a living and hybrid dictionary, where recording a word also meant telling the cultural story surrounding it. Covarrubias achieved this feat on his own. According to the philological studies of the Golden Age, his method of recording was revolutionary, but physically exhausting, through the systematic use of loose cards or strips of paper. Covarrubias would read texts, and when he found a word worthy of study, he would write it down on a piece of paper along with its etymology. Then he faced the chaos of alphabetically organizing those thousands of papers. The effort of recording everything by hand was so overwhelming that, as he approached the last letters of the alphabet, Covarrubias feared he would die of old age before seeing the work printed. That's why, if you look at El Tesoro, you'll notice that the articles for the letters A or C are extremely long and detailed essays, while those for the last letters are brief and rushed. By the 18th century, the Royal Spanish Academy turned that scattered work into an organized endeavor. Its Dictionary of Authorities, published between 1726 and 1739, was defined from the beginning as a work intended to explain the true meaning of words, their nature and quality, along with phrases or ways of speaking, proverbs or sayings. The novelty was that words were no longer recorded just by scholarly intuition, but with a collective method, a plan or set of rules, and with textual support taken from prestigious authors, the so-called authorities. The data processing system was as follows. First, the scholars divided among themselves the reading of the best works of Spanish literature. Then, as they read, they identified a representative use of a word wrote by hand on a standardized strip of paper, the word, its definition, and crucially, the exact quote from the book that demonstrated its legitimate use. Finally, thousands of these slips were placed in huge wooden cabinets with drawers, strictly organized in alphabetical order. This general file, which began to be compiled in the 18th century with pen and inkwell, became the great physical database of our language. The academics would take the slips out of the drawers and debate their content in the sessions before approving what would go to print. In this way, the recording of Spanish words went from the medieval marginal gloss to the printed repertoire, and from there to the academic dictionary based on rules, citations, and continuous review. And you, did you know this story about the dictionaries of the Spanish language? Are you one of those who still use a printed dictionary? Or are you immersed in the digital world? Leave us your opinion in the comments section. And that's all for today. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to this channel. Make sure to also turn on the notification bell so you get reminded when there's a new video. See you soon.